Taking two identical loaves of sourdough bread, I tried to completely degas one of them, knock all the air out, and I gently shaped the other one, trying to preserve the gas. My goal was to see if the degassed loaf and the not degassed loaf would look any different on the inside after they were baked. For this test, I made a double batch of my medium hydration sourdough bread recipe, which is at 75% hydration. Each loaf would end up having 325 grams of water, 10 grams of salt, 100 grams of active sourdough starter, and 450 grams of bread flour. I mixed together this double batch of dough, let it rest for a half hour, then I gave it 3 sets of stretch and folds, spaced out with a half hour of rest in between each one. Then I shaped the dough into a ball and let it rest in the bowl for about 4 to 5 hours until it completely doubled in size. This right here is what I was looking for. At this point, I was ready to split the dough into 2 separate specimens that I would treat a little bit differently, degassing one of them during shaping and shaping the other one really gently. So I divided the dough in 2, got my scale out to make sure they weighed the exact same amount, and then this dough on the left is going to be the one that I knock all the air out during the shaping process, and the one on the right I'm going to treat more gently, trying to not degas the dough at all. So I started by slapping the dough on the counter a few times and then flattening it out with my fingers, pressing out some of that air. This is what I often read that you're not supposed to do when you want a nice open crumb structure in your sourdough bread, but I'm convinced that this bread won't actually have as closed of a crumb structure as people say. I think it's going to get a lot of puff during the final proof, and it's going to have a little bit of an open crumb. I just really wanted to test this out to see if I was right or if it's going to be as closed as people always say. So I was being pretty heavy-handed with this dough, pushing it around, slapping it around, throwing it around, pressing it down, getting as much air out of there as I can. So with this dough fairly degassed, I pre-shaped it into a ball and got ready to pre-shape the other ball of dough. This one took a lot less time than the first one. I just went around the dough a few times with my bench scraper, forming it into a ball, and tried not to knock much of the gas out, and that was it. Then I let the 2 doughs bench rest on the counter for 30 minutes. After that rest, it was time to give these loaves their final shape, which would be my last real hands-on opportunity to degas this first loaf of sourdough bread. My plan was to use the same batard shaping technique on both of these loaves of bread, but to be really heavy-handed with the first one and have a really light touch on the second one, trying not to knock air out of that one. So the first one, I smacked it around a few times, pressed out the air, folded one of the thirds over the middle third, slapped it down again, and then folded the other third of dough over the middle third as well, slap, 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 maybe a few too many times, I'm not sure. And then I rolled the loaf from one end to the other, tucking and rolling, until I had a tight cylinder of dough just like this. Then I folded the ends of the dough underneath the loaf, on each side, just like that. And then there was my loaf of sourdough bread. Put a little flour on top, flipped it over into the banneton basket with the seam side up, gave it a few more knocks for good measure, and that'll be the degassed loaf of sourdough bread. For the other loaf, I shaped it the exact same way. I'm sure you understand where I'm going with this at this point. I was trying not to knock out any of the air, or at least knock out as little as I could. Folded 1/3 of the dough over the middle third, patted the seam down just a little bit so that it would stick. Then I folded the other third over the middle as well, patted it down to stick. Did the tension roll method again with the tuck and roll, being a little bit more gentle this time, trying not to squeeze any of the air out unintentionally. Then I folded the flap over on each side, just like this, and it was ready for the banneton basket. Flipped it over with the seam side up, and by this point I felt like I could already see a difference in these 2 loaves. The degassed dough on the left was just not quite as jiggly or as tall in the banneton basket as the other one, leading me to believe that more air had definitely been knocked out of it. It'll be interesting to see how that affects the interior of the bread after a 2-hour proof at room temperature. After 2 hours, the non-degassed loaf was pretty puffy and tall. The other one was slightly less tall and slightly less puffy. I decided to bake this puffy, non-degassed loaf of bread right away and let the other degassed loaf sit in the fridge for about 40 minutes while the first one bakes. This is the biggest glaring variable that I'm throwing into this experiment. If I could bake both of these loaves in 2 identical Dutch ovens in the same oven at the same time, I would, but I can't, so this is what I'm doing. I flipped the not degassed loaf of bread out onto some parchment paper, scored it with 1 long slash with a razor blade, and then it was off to the 500-degree oven. Baked it for 20 minutes with the lid on to trap the steam, and then for 15 minutes with the lid off. So far it looks like a very normal loaf of sourdough bread. Let's see how this next one bakes up. I took the degassed loaf of bread out of the fridge, flipped it onto some parchment paper, scored it with one long slash just like the first one. The short rest it had in the fridge made it easier to score than the first one, but it's what I had to do. Then it was off to the preheated oven for 20 minutes with the lid on to trap the steam, and 20 minutes with the lid off. Nice ear on this one too. So both of these loaves looked fairly similar on the outside after baking, but the point of the test was to see what they would look like on the inside. Would degassing my sourdough bread actually lead to a very closed crumb? We will see. I let them rest for an hour to cool down, and then it was time to slice in. This is the loaf that I baked first, the not degassed loaf, the one that I handled more gently. And the result on the inside was pretty much what I expect from a recipe and method like this one. There were some small irregular holes throughout the crumb, nothing crazy or too exaggerated, and it's definitely not a closed crumb. So this is what I'm used to getting when I make sourdough bread the way I do with this recipe. For this next loaf that I degassed, I really wasn't sure what to expect. Some people claim that overhandling your dough when you're shaping it, or degassing, is about the worst thing you can do, and you'll end up with a super fine closed crumb. Well, here's what it ended up looking like. Without any kind of doubt, this loaf had a closed crumb. The degassing definitely led to a finer crumb structure than the other loaf of bread. These two loaves used the same ingredients and had almost the exact same amount of fermentation time and proofing time, the only difference being how the dough was handled during shaping. So my big takeaway from this experiment is that people are generally right in what they say about degassing. If you want a more open crumb, be a little more gentle with your dough. But also, if you don't really care about getting an open crumb, don't worry about how heavy-handed you're being during the shaping process. Your loaf is going to end up tasting exactly the same, and you can be as heavy-handed or as delicate as you want to be. Another thing people often say is that you should let your cold-proof dough come back up to room temperature before you bake it. Here's what I think about that in this video right here.